When did you reverse racism? I was driving out of my gated community when this lady jumped off the curb right in front of my car. She was screaming and waving her arms like she was directing airplane traffic. I slammed my brakes and coffee went everywhere. She rushed to my window demanding to know if I lived there. Her face was red and spit flew as she yelled about watching me drive through her neighborhood. Her husband jogged over looking mortified in his cargo shorts and polo shirt. "Karen, please," he said, grabbing her elbow. "This is our neighbor from the blue house." She shook him off and demanded my driver's license like she was neighborhood security. Her pom-pom slippers made her authority act even more ridiculous. Instead of getting mad, I just started laughing. "You know what? Come over for drinks this afternoon. Let's get to know each other better as neighbors." The husband's jaw dropped. That's very kind of you." Karen kept sputtering about documentation while her husband dragged her away apologizing. I drove home sticky with coffee but oddly amused by the whole thing. 4 hours later, I walked to their house carrying red and white wine. Mitchell answered, looking shocked I actually came. Behind him, Karen shrieked, "Absolutely not!" from their living room. Mitchell's face went crimson as he stood in the doorway doing that awkward shuffle. "I'm so sorry. She's not feeling social, but maybe I could stop by your place in an hour?" I shrugged and walked home. Sure enough, an hour later, Mitchell knocked carrying a six-pack. We sat on my porch and he practically collapsed into a chair. "I'm really sorry about this morning. Karen's been getting worse lately. She watches the neighborhood Facebook page like it's her job." We cracked open beers and talked. Mitchell was a software engineer who worked from home and seemed desperate for normal conversation. We discovered we both loved craft beer and hated the HOA rules. After his third beer, he admitted Karen had called the police on 3 other neighbors this month alone. "I keep telling her she's going to get us sued, but she thinks she's protecting property values," he said miserably. We ordered pizza and moved inside to watch the game. Mitchell relaxed for the first time all day. He kept thanking me for being understanding and not filing a complaint about the morning incident. "You know what's crazy?" Mitchell said during halftime. "In 23 years of marriage, this is the first time I've just hung out with a friend without asking permission." We were laughing about the HOA's latest ridiculous rule about grass height when Mitchell's phone started buzzing. He ignored it. Then it rang, and rang, and rang. "Maybe you should answer," I suggested. Mitchell shook his head. "She's probably calling to demand I come home. For once, I'm going to enjoy my evening." His phone finally stopped. We high-fived and opened another beer. The third quarter had just started when I noticed something odd. A car had driven past my house 3 times, then another. They were moving slowly like they were looking for addresses. "Hey, Mitchell, does Karen know my exact house number?" "No. Why?" That's when we heard the sirens. Not just 1 or 2, but what sounded like every cop car in the county. The noise got louder and louder until red and blue lights were flashing through every window. I peeked through the blinds and my blood went cold. Multiple police cars had surrounded my house. Officers were taking positions behind their vehicles with weapons drawn. More cars kept arriving. I could see officers moving through my backyard. They had the whole property surrounded. "Oh my God," Mitchell whispered, looking through another window. "What did she tell them?" In my driveway, I could see Karen talking animatedly to what looked like a police captain. She was gesturing wildly at my house, and I could see her mouth forming words that looked like dangerous and hostage. Even from here, her pom-pom slippers looked ridiculous against the severity of what was happening. A megaphone crackled to life. "This is the police. We have the house completely surrounded. We know you're in there." Mitchell and I looked at each other in terror. Whatever Karen had told them, it was clearly more than just, "My husband is watching football." The tactical positions the officers were taking suggested they thought something serious was happening inside. "Should I go out there?" Mitchell asked, his face pale. "Wait," I said. "Let me think. If she told them you're in danger and you walk out fine, they'll know she lied. But if they think I'm dangerous..." The megaphone crackled again. "You have 30 seconds to respond before we escalate. Release the hostage immediately." Hostage. She'd told them Mitchell was a hostage. My hands started shaking as I realized how bad this could get. One wrong move and this could end with me dead on my own living room floor. Mitchell reached for the door handle, but I grabbed his arm. Outside, I could hear more sirens approaching. Whatever happened next would happen fast. Through the window, I saw an officer with SWAT gear arriving on scene. The megaphone counted down. 20 seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Mitchell looked at me with panic in his eyes as we both realized Karen might have finally gone too far. 10 seconds. The countdown hit 0, and I grabbed Mitchell's arm hard, yanking us both down behind my couch, just as the megaphone voice boomed that they were coming in. The front door exploded inward with a crack that made my ears ring, wood splintering everywhere as officers poured through like water breaking a dam. Red laser dots swept across my walls and ceiling while boots thundered on my hardwood floors, more officers streaming in through what used to be my doorframe. They were screaming commands all at once, telling us to show our hands, get on the ground, don't move, all of it mixing into this wall of noise that made thinking impossible. Mitchell and I hit the floor face first, arms stretched out wide while rifle barrels pointed at us from every direction. My cheek pressed against the cold wood, and I could see dust bunnies under my entertainment center that I'd missed while cleaning. Such a stupid thing to notice while cops had guns on me. More boots kept coming, officers calling out clear as they swept through my kitchen, my hallway, checking every closet and room like they expected to find bodies or bombs. Someone's knee pressed into my back while hands patted me down for weapons, pulling my phone and wallet from my pockets before zip-tying my wrists behind me so tight the plastic bit into my skin. Mitchell grunted next to me as they did the same to him, both of us lying there like criminals while my house got torn apart by what looked like half the police force. I managed to turn my head enough to tell the officer kneeling on me that I was the homeowner, and this was all a huge mistake. But he just said they were following protocol for a reported hostage situation and to stay still. After what felt like forever, but was probably 10 minutes, they finally let us sit up against the wall, though they kept us about 6 feet apart with an officer standing between us. The lead officer grabbed his radio and reported the scene was secure with 2 males in custody and no weapons found, which made me want to laugh because the most dangerous thing in my house was probably the expired milk in my fridge. Through my living room window, I could see Karen out in my driveway talking to someone who looked like the police captain, her arms waving around like she was conducting an orchestra while those stupid pom-pom slippers bounced with every gesture. Even from inside, I could see her mouth forming words, and it looked like she kept saying dangerous and threatened over and over while pointing at my house. A woman in plain clothes ducked through my broken doorframe and introduced herself as a crisis negotiator, crouching down in front of me with this careful expression like I might snap at any moment. She started asking me gentle questions about what happened tonight, so I explained about the morning incident with Karen jumping in front of my car, how I'd invited them for drinks to smooth things over, and how Mitchell had come by to watch the game instead. Across the room, I could hear Mitchell telling another officer his version, his voice shaking as he explained that his wife had been calling the police on neighbors a lot lately, 3 times just this month, and the officer taking notes looked more and more doubtful with every word. The negotiator asked to see my phone to verify our timeline, so the officer who'd taken it handed it over, and she scrolled through my texts with Mitchell about watching the game, then walked over to check that my TV was actually on the sports channel we'd claimed. She took photos of the pizza box on my coffee table and the beer bottles lined up on the side table, documenting everything while more officers tramped through my house taking pictures and notes. After about an hour of this, 2 officers brought Karen inside to give her statement, but they took her straight to my dining room while moving Mitchell and me to separate bedrooms, so we couldn't hear each other or her. I sat on my bed with my wrists still zip-tied, watching through my bedroom window as more police cars kept arriving like this was the crime of the century instead of a crazy neighbor making stuff up. The officer guarding me kept checking his watch and shaking his head, and I heard him mutter something about overtime and false reports when his radio crackled with updates. Through my closed door, I could hear muffled voices, Karen's high-pitched tone cutting through even when I couldn't make out the words, then long silences, then more talking. Finally, the police captain himself came into my room carrying a tablet, and he pulled up security footage from the neighborhood gate that showed Mitchell walking up my driveway at exactly the time we'd said, carrying his 6-pack and looking relaxed, not like someone being held against his will. The timestamp on the footage matched our story perfectly, showing Mitchell had been here for hours before Karen called claiming he was in danger. The captain's face got harder with every frame he reviewed, and he called someone on his radio to bring the woman who'd made the report to the living room immediately. 2 officers walked Karen into my living room, and she was still talking non-stop about how she'd seen suspicious activity and knew something bad was happening. The captain stood there with his arms crossed while Karen kept pointing at me and saying she'd been watching my house for months because she knew I was up to no good. Mitchell came out of the other bedroom with his guard, and his face went white when he saw his wife standing there in her pom-pom slippers, still trying to convince everyone she was right. An officer near the captain leaned over and told him they'd searched the whole house and found nothing. No weapons, no drugs, no evidence of any crime at all. The captain's jaw got tight, and he stared at Karen, who was still rambling about how she'd heard screaming and knew Mitchell was in danger. She kept insisting she'd done the right thing and that they should be thanking her for being vigilant about neighborhood safety. The negotiator pulled the captain aside, and they had a quick conversation while looking at their notes and shaking their heads. Mitchell stood there rubbing his wrists where the zip ties had been, and I could see red marks all around them from how tight they'd been. My living room was completely wrecked with couch cushions thrown everywhere, books scattered on the floor, and my TV stand pulled away from the wall where they'd checked behind it. Picture frames were face down on the coffee table, and my kitchen drawers were all open from their search. The captain walked back over and told us they were removing the restraints, but we couldn't leave while they finished their investigation. An officer cut the zip ties off my wrists, and the blood rushed back into my hands, making them tingle and burn. My wrists were raw and had deep red lines where the plastic had cut into my skin for the past 2 hours. The negotiator came back after talking to Karen in another room for 20 minutes and told us Karen had admitted she might have exaggerated some details because she was worried about her husband's safety. She explained that Karen claimed she heard screaming from my house, which the officers figured was probably just us cheering during the game. Karen also said she saw Mitchell looking distressed through the window, which was probably him getting excited about a touchdown or something. The negotiator kept apologizing and saying they had to take every report seriously, but it was becoming clear this was a false alarm. Mitchell started shaking when he heard what Karen had told them, and tears ran down his face. He kept saying he was sorry over and over, and that he couldn't believe she'd done this to us. The officers took photos of our wrists and documented the injuries from when they'd tackled us to the ground and zip-tied us. Mitchell had a bruise forming on his cheek from where his face hit the floor, and my shoulder was killing me from how they'd twisted my arm behind my back. More officers kept coming and going, filling out paperwork and taking statements from everyone, including the neighbors who'd come outside to watch. It was almost 2 a.m. when the captain finally said we were free to go, but would need to come to the station the next day for official statements. He personally apologized for the response and explained they had to treat every hostage report as real until proven otherwise. Mitchell asked if he could stay at my place because he couldn't face going home to Karen right now. We sat in my destroyed living room surrounded by the mess the police had made, and neither of us could sleep. My hands were still shaking, and every time I closed my eyes I saw those rifles pointed at my face. Mitchell kept pacing around and apologizing and saying he should have answered his phone when Karen called earlier. We tried watching TV but couldn't focus on anything, and just sat there in silence most of the night. Around 5 a.m, Mitchell finally passed out on the couch, and I dozed off in my chair. My phone started buzzing like crazy around 7, and when I checked it, the neighborhood Facebook group had completely exploded. Someone had posted a video of all the police cars and SWAT vehicles surrounding my house, and everyone was going nuts trying to figure out what happened. People were saying it was a drug bust, others thought it was terrorism-related, and one person claimed they heard it was a murder. The comments kept coming with everyone sharing what they supposedly saw or heard and making up wilder and wilder stories. Then Karen posted this vague message about how she was just trying to keep our neighborhood safe from dangerous individuals who might threaten our property values and way of life. She didn't mention any names, but it was obvious she was talking about me and trying to make herself look like some kind of hero. Mitchell woke up, and I showed him the post on his phone, and his face went from pale to bright red with anger. He started typing a response but then deleted it and threw his phone on the couch, saying it wasn't worth it. We got dressed and drove to the police station where they made us wait for an hour before taking us to separate rooms for our statements. The detective who interviewed me seemed nice and kept shaking his head as I told him the whole story from the beginning. He mentioned this wasn't the first false report they'd gotten recently, and that people were getting too paranoid these days. I spent 3 hours going over every detail while he typed it all up and had me sign multiple forms. Mitchell was in another room telling his side, and when we met up afterward, he looked exhausted. He told me he'd explained to the detective about Karen's pattern of calling 911 on neighbors, and gave them specific dates and incidents. The detective had pulled up all those reports on his computer, and found 3 calls just from this month alone, plus several more going back over the past year. Each time Karen had claimed something serious was happening, but when police showed up it was nothing. Just kids playing too loud or someone parking in front of her house or a delivery truck she didn't recognize. The detective walked us out and told us to stay available for follow-up questions if needed. Mitchell and I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, just staring ahead, not saying anything. He looked completely drained and kept rubbing his face with both hands. I dropped him off at his hotel and drove straight to the law office my neighbor had recommended a few months back when I had that issue with the contractor. The attorney was a woman in her 50s who listened to my whole story while taking notes on a yellow pad. She kept shaking her head, and when I finished, she put down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She explained that what Karen did was actually several different crimes rolled into one really dangerous situation. Filing a false police report was the obvious one, but she said the way Karen did it by claiming there was a hostage situation could be charged as attempted murder by cop, since she knew armed police would respond. She pulled out more papers and started listing all the ways I could go after Karen in civil court, too. There was the damage to my front door from when police broke it down, plus my wrists were still bruised from the zip ties, and she said the emotional trauma of having guns pointed at me in my own home was worth serious money. She also brought up Karen's Facebook posts and said those counted as defamation, since she was spreading lies about me being dangerous to the whole neighborhood. We spent 2 hours going through everything while she typed up notes and had me sign papers authorizing her to start building the case. She took photos of my wrists and the damage to my house and said she'd request the police body cam footage, too. My phone buzzed while I was signing papers, and it was Mitchell texting that he couldn't go back home and was going to stay at the hotel for a while. He said he'd been on the phone with divorce lawyers all afternoon trying to figure out how to separate from Karen after being married for so long. I showed the text to my attorney, and she nodded like she'd seen this before. On my drive home, my phone kept lighting up with messages from neighbors I barely knew. 3 different families reached out saying they needed to talk to me about Karen. One guy who lived 2 streets over said Karen had called CPS on them last summer because their 8-year-old was riding his bike in the driveway without a parent standing right there. The investigation took weeks and nearly destroyed their family, even though CPS found nothing wrong. Another neighbor said Karen reported them to animal control, claiming they were abusing their dog just because it barked sometimes during the day while they were at work. The third family said they almost sold their house and moved after Karen kept calling the cops on their teenage son for playing basketball in their own driveway after school. That evening, the HOA president called my cell phone, which was weird since I'd never talked to him before. He sounded really nervous and said he needed to call an emergency meeting about what happened, because the HOA could be liable if one of the residents was going around making false reports that put other residents in danger. He wanted to create new rules about how complaints between neighbors should be handled and said he was worried about getting sued if something worse happened. He scheduled the meeting for 3 days later at the community center. The next morning, Mitchell called and asked if he could stop by to grab something from his computer at home, but he didn't want to go alone. We drove to his house together, and Karen's car wasn't there, which was a relief. Mitchell went straight to their home office and logged into the desktop computer. His hands were shaking as he clicked through folders, and then his face went white. He turned the screen toward me, and there was a folder labeled Neighborhood Watch Evidence, with subfolders for different addresses, including mine. Inside my folder were screenshots going back 6 months of every photo I'd posted on social media, even stuff from my private Instagram that she must have gotten from someone else. There were photos of my car with notes about what time I left for work, pictures of delivery trucks at my house with timestamps, and even screenshots of comments I'd made in the neighborhood Facebook group. Mitchell found similar folders for 5 other neighbors with the same creepy level of detail. He forwarded everything to my attorney's email and to his divorce lawyer, too. 2 days later, the detective called to tell me they'd finished their investigation and were recommending charges against Karen for filing a false report and reckless endangerment. He said the district attorney would review everything within the week and decide whether to prosecute. He also mentioned that finding out about Karen's previous false reports to 911 made this much more serious, since it showed a pattern of behavior. My attorney got the news, too, and immediately filed a cease and desist letter demanding Karen stop posting about me online and stay at least 100 feet away from my property. She also demanded Karen stop taking photos of my house and delete all the screenshots and surveillance notes she'd been keeping. We sent it certified mail and through email to make sure she got it. The HOA meeting came 3 days later, and the community center was packed with way more people than I'd ever seen at one of these things. The president started explaining what happened and why we needed new policies. But before he could finish, people started shouting from different parts of the room. Some neighbors were defending Karen, saying she was just trying to keep everyone safe, while others started sharing their own stories about her harassment. One older couple said Karen had measured their grass with a ruler and reported them to the HOA for being a 1/4 inch too tall. Another family said she'd called the cops on their nanny for sitting in a parked car during her break. The room got louder and louder, with people arguing about whether Karen was protecting the neighborhood or terrorizing it. Mitchell had been sitting quietly in the back, but suddenly stood up and walked to the front of the room. His voice was shaking, but he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He apologized for what his wife had done and admitted she needed professional help. He said he'd been in denial for years, but watching me almost get shot by police finally made him realize how dangerous her behavior had become. Karen must have been listening from outside, because she burst through the doors, screaming that we were all conspiring against her, and that she was the only one who cared about property values and keeping criminals out of the neighborhood. She pointed at different people, calling them lazy, irresponsible, and dangerous before the HOA president told her she needed to leave, or he'd call security. She stormed out, yelling that we'd all regret this when the neighborhood went to hell without her watching over things. The HOA president called another meeting 2 weeks later, and this time the room was even more packed with people standing against the walls. He put up a PowerPoint about new safety rules and started reading from prepared notes about needing proof before making complaints about neighbors. People started voting by raising hands, and it passed 37-12, with most of Karen's supporters looking mad, but outnumbered. The president also announced the Facebook group couldn't be used for security alerts anymore, unless someone had actual evidence like photos or police reports. Karen sat in the front row taking notes and shaking her head the whole time, while Mitchell sat way in the back looking at his phone. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 security cameras mounted on Karen's house, all pointing directly at my property and other neighbors' houses. She'd installed them overnight using some kind of telescoping poles that reached up to her roofline. I took photos and called the HOA president, who came over within an hour to look at them himself. He stood in my driveway shaking his head and said this violated at least 4 different privacy rules in our community guidelines. He walked straight to Karen's house, and I watched through my window as they argued on her porch for 20 minutes. She kept pointing at the cameras and then at various houses while he held up what looked like the HOA rulebook. Eventually he left, and she went inside, slamming her door so hard I heard it from my living room. 3 days later, the detective called to tell me the district attorney had reviewed everything and decided to move forward with criminal charges. He said they'd be arresting Karen within the next day or two for filing a false police report and misuse of emergency services. I asked if Mitchell knew, and he said they'd try to do it when he wasn't home to minimize the drama. The arrest happened the next afternoon while I was working from home, and Mitchell was at his office. 4 police cars pulled up to their house, and officers walked up to the door with papers in their hands. Karen answered wearing her bathrobe, and I could hear her screaming from inside my house, even with all the windows closed. They put her in handcuffs right there on her porch, while half the neighborhood watched from their driveways and windows. She kept yelling about her rights and demanding to call her lawyer as they walked her to the patrol car. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes, but the neighborhood Facebook group exploded with posts and comments within seconds. Mitchell called me that night sobbing so hard I could barely understand him at first. He said he'd gotten home to find crime scene tape on his door and a note from the police about Karen's arrest. He kept saying he didn't know what to do because she was his wife, but she'd also almost gotten me killed with her lies. He told me he'd been staying at the Hampton Inn down the street for a week already, because he couldn't deal with her anger about the HOA meeting. His voice cracked when he admitted he was almost out of money and didn't know where he'd go next. I told him to pack a bag and come stay in my guest room until he figured things out. He showed up an hour later with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag looking like he hadn't slept in days. We didn't talk much that first night, but I showed him the guest room and told him to stay as long as he needed. The next few days were quiet, with Mitchell mostly working from the guest room and only coming out for food. Karen posted bail after 3 days, and the first thing she did was drive straight to my house at 7 in the morning. She stood on my lawn screaming for Mitchell to come out and calling me a homewrecker and saying I'd destroyed her marriage. Mitchell was shaking in the kitchen while I called 911 and told them someone was violating a restraining order on my property. The dispatcher recognized my address and said units were already on the way because neighbors had called too. Karen kept pounding on my door until 3 police cars showed up and officers got out already looking tired of dealing with her. They arrested her right there on my porch while she screamed about being set up and how we were all conspiring against her. The same detective called me later to say the judge had revoked her bail after this second arrest and she'd be held until trial. He said judges don't like it when people violate restraining orders hours after posting bail because it shows they won't follow court orders. Mitchell cried again when I told him, but also looked relieved like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The local news picked up the story a week later, though they didn't use our real names or show our houses. They called it a cautionary tale about false 911 calls and interviewed the police chief about wasting resources. After the story aired, 3 more neighbors contacted me privately to share their own stories about Karen's harassment over the years. One family said she'd called animal control on their indoor cat, claiming it was a danger to the neighborhood. Another couple said she'd reported them to code enforcement 17 times for things like leaving their trash cans out an hour too long. Mitchell started seeing a therapist the week after the news story and came home from his first session looking shocked. He told me the therapist helped him realize Karen had been controlling every part of his life for decades. She'd picked his clothes, controlled their bank accounts, decided what he could watch on TV, and even monitored his work emails. He said he hadn't been allowed to have friends over since they bought the house 8 years ago. I started therapy too because I couldn't shake the image of all those guns pointed at me in my own living room. My therapist specialized in trauma from police encounters and said what I was feeling was totally normal for someone who'd been through that. I'd wake up at night thinking I heard sirens or jump when cars drove by too slowly. The fear that police might burst through my door again made it hard to relax even in my own home. 3 weeks later, we were sitting in a courtroom watching Karen's lawyer stand up and start talking about anxiety disorders. He pulled out medical records and waved them around saying Karen had been diagnosed years ago and that her fear of me was genuine because of her condition. The prosecutor stood up holding a thick folder and started reading dates and addresses from all the false reports Karen had filed over the past 5 years. She listed 17 different incidents where Karen had called police on neighbors for things like kids playing basketball or someone parking too close to her driveway. The judge looked annoyed as the prosecutor showed a pattern of Karen using 911 like her personal complaint line. Mitchell sat next to me taking notes on everything being said because his divorce lawyer wanted copies of all the court documents. After court, Mitchell drove straight to his lawyer's office and filed the divorce papers he'd been putting off for weeks. The lawyer helped him fill out forms for separating their bank accounts and dividing their assets. Mitchell signed papers requesting the house since Karen's arrests happened there, and she couldn't return anyway because of the restraining order. 2 days later, Mitchell called me sounding confused because his lawyer found 3 bank accounts Karen had hidden with almost $40,000 total. The statements showed she'd been moving money from their joint account for 2 years, putting $500 here and $300 there into accounts only in her name. Mitchell's lawyer said this was financial fraud, and they could use it in the divorce to get Mitchell a better settlement. The HOA president called an emergency meeting that week and announced they were bringing in a professional mediator to teach conflict resolution. He said our incident had made the board realize the neighborhood had serious communication problems that needed fixing before someone got hurt. The mediator showed up the next Tuesday and set up chairs in a circle at the community center. About 20 people came, which was less than half the neighborhood, but more than I expected. She made us do exercises about listening without judging and finding common ground even when we disagreed. Some people rolled their eyes, but others actually took notes and asked questions about handling difficult neighbors. 3 weeks after Karen's arrest, the prosecutor called to say Karen wanted to plead guilty to reduced charges. Instead of felony charges for the false report and endangerment, she'd plead to misdemeanor disturbing the peace and misuse of emergency services. The deal required Mitchell and me to agree since we were the victims, and Karen would get probation instead of jail time. The prosecutor said Karen would have to do community service and mandatory therapy twice a week for a year. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the plea agreement for hours, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted Karen to face real consequences for almost getting me killed, but another part just wanted this whole thing over. Mitchell came over and we talked about it over beers on my back porch since we both avoided my living room now. He said he wanted to agree to the deal because maybe therapy would actually help Karen understand what she'd done wrong. We both signed the papers the next day and faxed them to the prosecutor's office. At sentencing, the judge gave Karen 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service at a mental health facility. She also banned Karen from calling 911 except for real emergencies and said any violation would mean immediate jail time. Karen had to pay $5,000 in fines and court costs, plus reimburse the police department for the SWAT response. The judge made it clear that if Karen violated any part of the sentence, she'd serve the maximum jail time for the original charges. Meanwhile, the HOA hired an actual police officer to run a neighborhood watch training program. The officer used our incident as his main example, showing a PowerPoint with response times and costs from that night. He explained that false reports waste resources that could save lives and taught everyone the difference between suspicious and just different. Half the room kept looking at me during his presentation, but I just focused on taking notes about when to actually call police. Mitchell's divorce went through fast since Karen had violated the restraining order twice and committed financial fraud. The judge gave Mitchell the house and most of their assets, but Mitchell told me he couldn't stand living there anymore. He hired movers the next week and put the house on the market, saying every room reminded him of their fights. I finally called someone to fix my front door that the police had destroyed during the raid. The contractor had to replace the whole frame because the battering ram had cracked the wood beyond repair. While he worked, I ordered a security system with cameras covering every entrance to my house. The installation guy said he'd been getting lots of calls from our neighborhood lately and asked if something had happened. I just told him we'd had some break-ins and left it at that, not wanting to explain the whole story again. The security system had motion sensors and an alarm that would call my phone before alerting the monitoring company. Mitchell found a one-bedroom apartment across town near his office and seemed happier every time I saw him. We started meeting at a sports bar downtown to watch games instead of at my house because neither of us felt comfortable there anymore. He bought new furniture and decorated his place how he wanted for the first time in decades. During one game, he told me he'd joined a hiking group and was planning a camping trip, something Karen had never let him do. He looked younger somehow without the stress of constantly managing Karen's moods and paranoia. 3 months into her court-ordered therapy, Karen started sending out these typed apology letters to everyone she'd harassed over the years. Mine showed up on a Tuesday morning with the official therapy center letterhead and everything. She wrote about recognizing her anxiety issues and taking responsibility for the SWAT incident, but it felt like her therapist had basically dictated the whole thing. Mitchell told me she'd sent similar letters to 12 other neighbors, including the family she'd called CPS on. Most people just threw them away, but the older couple down the street actually wrote back saying they accepted her apology and hoped she'd get better. The neighborhood Facebook group stayed pretty quiet without Karen's constant posts about suspicious cars and people walking dogs too early in the morning. You could tell there was this weird split, though, between the people who still thought Karen had been protecting the neighborhood and those of us who'd been targeted by her. At the next HOA meeting, half the room wouldn't even look at me and Mitchell, while the other half kept coming up to share their own Karen stories. The HOA president tried to keep things focused on normal stuff like landscaping budgets, but every discussion somehow circled back to what happened that night with the police. 6 months after everything went down, Mitchell called me all excited about this woman he'd met at a coffee shop near his new apartment. Her name was Sarah, and she worked as a nurse at the hospital downtown. He kept saying he couldn't believe someone normal actually wanted to date him after 23 years with Karen. They'd been out 4 times, and she hadn't once checked his phone or demanded to know where he was every minute. He was learning basic relationship stuff, like it was okay to have different opinions about movies, and that arguments didn't have to turn into screaming matches. Meanwhile, my lawsuit against Karen's homeowner's insurance finally went through after months of paperwork and depositions. The insurance company settled for $35,000, which covered my therapy sessions, the new security system, the door replacement, and left me with enough to take a nice vacation. My lawyer said they wanted to avoid a jury trial where the SWAT footage would play badly for them. The check arrived the same week Mitchell told me Karen was finally moving. She'd finished her community service hours at the mental health facility and decided to go live with her sister in Arizona. Mitchell helped her pack just to make sure she actually left and told me she seemed different, like the fight had gone out of her. The moving truck pulled away on a Thursday afternoon, and you could practically feel the whole neighborhood exhale. 3 weeks later, the HOA sent out this new policy document they called the Good Neighbor Guidelines, which written because of our incident. It had specific rules about when to call police, what constituted actual suspicious behavior, and consequences for false reports, including HOA fines and possible legal action. They even brought in that police officer again to do another training about the difference between being vigilant and being paranoid. Everyone knew why these rules existed, but nobody said Karen's name out loud anymore. Mitchell and I kept meeting up for games, though we'd switched to this sports bar downtown that had better wings anyway. We'd joke sometimes about how Karen accidentally did us both a favor by being so crazy that night. He got free from a toxic marriage, and I learned to take suburban safety seriously with my new security system and cameras. His new girlfriend, Sarah, started joining us sometimes, and she was cool about the whole story, even though it sounded completely insane when we explained it. She said she could tell Mitchell had been through something rough, but that he was working on himself, and that's what mattered. The insurance money let me take 2 weeks off work to just decompress and deal with the lingering anxiety from having guns pointed at me in my own home. My therapist said it would take time to feel completely safe again, but I was making progress. Mitchell was doing his own therapy too, and said it was helping him recognize all the ways Karen had controlled him that he'd thought were normal. Like he'd never realized other couples didn't have hour-long interrogations about credit card purchases under $20. The annual neighborhood BBQ rolled around in September, and for the first time in years, people actually seemed relaxed. Mitchell brought Sarah and introduced her to everyone while I just enjoyed not feeling like I had to watch my back constantly. People were actually talking to each other face to face instead of posting creepy photos on Facebook asking if anyone recognized their neighbor's house guest. The HOA president made some speech about community and working together, but everyone knew he meant we'd all learned our lesson about letting paranoia take over. Nobody called the cops even when some teenagers got a little loud playing basketball at the park next door. Mitchell won the cornhole tournament, and Sarah high-fived me when he beat the guy who'd supported Karen at all those HOA meetings. It felt like the neighborhood had finally found its balance again, even though we all knew what happened that night had changed everything permanently. Well, that's gonna do it for me today. Appreciate you hanging out and questioning things right along with me. Always feels like a real journey when we share it together. Subscribe for more content like this.